Also, the ships and guns the foreigners bought in reminded the Chinese that their own people appeared to be weak. I can imagine, I mean, having grown up in poverty, and you look around the other kids at school and they're all dressed nicer than you are, and their dads are driving finer cars than you are, and they don't seem to have the financial worries you do. Some of you might have some idea what I'm talking about. Anyway, there's the Chinese. These Europeans came over and their ships were bigger than anything they had, not as big as the ships they once had now. The Chinese are believed to have built 450 long wooden ships, but they're bigger than anything the Chinese had now, and their cannon were better than anything that the Chinese had, and to think it was the Chinese who had invented gunpowder. Well, if the Chinese invented gunpowder, how come these Europeans from all the way across Eurasia had better weapons with gunpowder than we have? Well, because you stayed still and they moved forward. All right, which takes us to the issue of opium. When the Chinese refused to trade, the British said, we're more powerful than they and we need the money they can bring these millions of people. We will force trade with them. Now, folks, this, what I'm about to tell you, is very immoral and very wrong, but they did it. They went in and convinced some of the Chinese people to use opium. And their justification for it was, well, these people are prone to opium use anyway. Now, folks, that's not me talking. This is them. Okay, understood? Not me. And therefore, these people were just, so let's go in. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest profiteers from the opium trade was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's father, Mr. Roosevelt, I'll call him. I don't even know what his first name was, but our President Roosevelt. His father made millions of dollars selling opium to the Chinese. Was it morally wrong? Absolutely. I'm convinced of it. But they saw nothing about it. And if they want to buy the opium, well, let them. Opium is, as you may know, a highly addictive drug. It can be used for medicine purposes, but it's a highly addictive drug, and the Chinese people seem to be more susceptible to it than Westerners. Folks, I don't mean to be right, but I've got to say this. Another person who told me this is true. A lot of American Indians and Oriental peoples simply cannot handle drinking alcohol. Now, when I was in the Army, they'd sometimes turn the men loose and let them go drinking. And the Oriental peoples who drank could not handle it. They'd come back to barracks, and one of them couldn't even unlock his locker. He had to tell us his combination so that we could unlock his locker for him. And the rest of his behavior was so bad, I just can't go into detail here. Again, it wasn't anybody forced him to drink. He just chose to do that. The next morning, oh, he was all apologetic. He went around and apologized to all of us. So I made a dunce out of myself last night, didn't I? But anyway, the Chinese seem to be susceptible to this. Now, let me tell you, I'm going to jump ahead of the story a little bit. The Chinese did solve their opium problem later. Your book just says decisive government action finally stopped the opium. Here's what I understand are the details. The Chinese government passed a law that anyone who was caught using was to be first offense put into isolation and withdrawn cold turkey. They didn't care whether they lived or died. That's on first offense. Second offense, death penalty. As for the user, death penalty, first offense. Not the user, but as for the pusher. The pusher, death penalty, first offense. The user, death penalty on the second offense. I have asked the question, what if we, as politically correct as we are, decided to be that decisive about our drug issues? Would we solve the drug problem?
Yeah.
You're saying we wouldn't? Okay, no, we wouldn't. Okay, we wouldn't. For the Chinese, it worked. The Chinese hardly use opium anymore.
They have a different culture.
They have a different culture. That is true. They do have a different culture than we, where they expect that kind of action high up. I don't think Americans would tolerate it. But
They should tolerate it.
what's that?
I don't think they should tolerate it.
Perhaps not.
It's way too invasive.
Again, I'm not advocating this. You understand? I'm just saying that when you find that people who have had a drug problem and solved it, how did they solve it? You have to at least, you might say, blink and stare at their solution. And otherwise, you wind up Anyway, there are other ways to solve it. But anyway, Chinese were forced into opium. They blamed their opium use on the foreigners, so they engaged in a war with the British called the Opium War. The Opium War featured the Chinese junks. Now that word junk is not in any way, the word junk in English is a derogatory term. But the Chinese junks were their sailing vessels. Instead of using cloth for sails, they used bamboo shoots. The Chinese junks were pitted against British warships, and the result was the Chinese junks were blown to smithereens. They were no match for the British warships. The Opium War showed China to be weak. The British then moved in and took over Hong Kong. When the British moved into Hong Kong in the late 1890s, they made an agreement with China and said, all right, in the year 1997, we'll give Hong Kong back to you. That meant 100 years from now, we'll give it back to you, or 99 years, we'll give it back to you. They figured nobody would be alive. Well, when I was a kid, you know, we were told by teachers, now the British government has promised China that they're going to give Hong Kong back in 1997. In 1964, 1997 seemed like a long time off. But guess what? The year 1997 came, and the British, in keeping with the treaty they'd made 99 years before, gave Hong Kong back to China. Hong Kong didn't even want to go back. But it was part of the British had made an agreement in good faith with the Chinese, and Hong Kong went back. What's that?
They're far more westernized.
Hong Kong life was much, much better than China, than life in the rest of China. But nevertheless, the old maps will show Hong Kong as being part of Britain. The Chinese began to realize, hey, we must change. So they began to make efforts at reform. There had been a rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, which your book talks about. The Taiping Rebellion was a rebellion of Chinese against their government that the Chinese eventually put down. But it did show the Chinese government, hey, there's a lot of unrest here that we have to deal with. So they fought the Opium War against the British and lost miserably. The Taiping Rebellion almost resulted in a hostile takeover. So they began to reform. But the Taiping Rebellion, after being put down, was still, some of the local commanders refused to disassemble their armies, and they began to set up other rebellions. So China continued to wallow in its misery. Other nations came in, and they set up what's called spheres of influence in China. Now, you'll notice the United States was not involved in this, but to the nations that were. Russia took over much of what is Manchuria and part of Mongolia. Japan, they took over South Korea and the island of Taiwan. Britain took over Hong Kong and much of Tibet and other parts. The Germans also got involved with their small territory in between China and Vietnam. France expanded what they already held in Vietnam. Even Italy got a small section of the Chinese coast. So 6 European countries moved in, and they took over part of Chinese territory and set up spheres of influence. How do you spell that word? S-P-H-E-R-E. S-P-H-E. Where that basically they took over a small part, and they used the small part they'd taken over to force the Chinese people to trade with, just trade opium, but trade other goods, and basically humiliate the Chinese government because the Chinese simply found themselves overwhelmed. 6 nations came upon them at once. And again, it was because of their antiquated military, antiquated navy, and antiquated policies, and the Europeans were just simply hitting them with overwhelming numbers, overwhelming force. Actually, of all these 6 nations, I believe all 6 of them could have beaten China by themselves. But then 6 of them jumping in at once. I want to correct one thing I just said. One of these nations was Japan. 5 of them were European countries, the 6th one was Japan.
Who did you say?
They're listed on page 643. They're listed the 5 European countries: Russia, Britain, Germany, France, and Italy, with Japan getting the island of Taiwan and a good bit of the Chinese coast. They're right across from Taiwan. So foreign pressure intensified on a dynasty, and then you might almost say one of the worst things that could have happened to China did happen. A very conservative empress took over. And let's see. Her name is spelled C-I-X-I. I'm looking for the pronunciation of her name. I believe that's... How's that? Somebody pronounced it. Sisi. All right, thank you. Empress Sisi took over. Your book doesn't have much kind of thing to say about it. Empress Sisi had been the concubine of one of the emperors. When the emperor died, she managed to wiggle and finesse her way into the front position by putting her son on the throne who was a puppet. Then she put her son out of the way, killed her son, and said that she was the Empress of China. And she ruled China for a good many years, and she was resistant to all change, which was the absolute worst thing that could have happened to China at this time. I mean, folk, her action of taking over might be called shrewd in some circles, but it's like a lot of major league ball players have learned. It's one thing to make the team, but guess what? Once you've made the team, you're expected to make that team a winner. And I played high school football for a while, and sometimes these big boys thought we can dominate the team, and they were the biggest boys on the team. But then they'd start playing other teams and find the other teams had boys who were just as big as they were. And oftentimes the big boys on my team got pushed around and shoved around by other teams because the other teams had people who were their size and could, you might say, clean their plow. Sisi got herself ahead by putting aside all the opposition and taking over. But once she had taken over, she had to rule, and she was not quite capable. Your book shows a picture on page 544 of her and Britain's Queen Victoria, and asks you to somewhat compare them. Queen Victoria was not allowed to be actually queen. She was more or less a figurehead. But she had she ruled by influence, governed by influence more than actual power. The Chinese empress had the actual authority. She could have made or broke China. Had she been a wiser woman, she might have made China. As it was, she broke China by insisting that China go back to its traditional ways. Now, the United States began to influence the affairs, and they said, hey, what's happened is European countries and Japan have taken over their own little sections, but Secretary of State John Hay, under William McKinley, he's told the world that we should have what's called an open door policy. Open door, where that, hey, let's allow everybody to trade equally with China and not just have each nation trade within their own sphere of influence, but let all the world trade, including the United States, including Latin America, and including the nations already there. So he proposed an open door policy for China, which might have benefited the Chinese if they could have seen the benefits of it. Instead, the Chinese youngsters, the young people, when I talk about young people, I'm talking about college age Chinese students, got together and they said, hey, the problem with China is these foreigners. Let's drive the foreigners out. So they organized a group called the Fist of Righteousness, otherwise known as Boxers. And they got together and set up the Boxer Rebellion. And they began by killing all the foreigners they could find, including a bunch of American missionaries. And and European missionaries also. Well, the rest of Europe got together, you might say the European nations got together, and they fought against these young Boxers and put down the rebellion. But nevertheless, the Boxers had made their point. The point being, we don't want foreigners here. Well, the old dynasty realized that they had to try to reform themselves somehow. They couldn't. They did try some reforms. Their reforms failed. Something else that I don't see it here, but I know it occurred at this time, was what's called the Sino-Japanese War. Anyway, I am going to mention the the word Sino here means China. Japan basically invaded China. The war was fought over Korea, and the Japanese won easily. The Japanese moved in and took over Korea, and it showed the whole world that China was a weak nation. Big on the map, yes, but weak otherwise. And this opened the door to a whole lot of other persons moving in. Regrettably, I can't find the reference to the Sino-Japanese War here, but I know it's somewhere in the book, somewhere right in here. But anyway, the Sino-Japanese War, where Japan fought a war against China. The war was fought over Korea. Well, things continued to decline for China. This eventually led to the collapse of the last Chinese dynasty. Now, long about 30 or so years ago, there was a movie made called The Last Emperor. And your book makes some reference to it in one of these little vignettes. But essentially, the last emperor of China was a boy emperor, just a few years old, who simply was too young to take command. And essentially, to make a long story short, what happened was a medical doctor named Sun Yat-sen moved in, took over China, deposed the emperor, and set up a government which he called a republic. Now, from that day till this, the Chinese call their system of government republic. They call it, well, there was two Chinese governments, one on the island of Formosa and one on the mainland. They both called themselves the Republic of China. They're still calling themselves a republic, but the fact is, Sun Yat-sen's republic, he did not last long at the head of it. Now, I'd like to be able to stand up here and tell you that when Sun Yat-sen took over and set himself as a head, all the Chinese problems were solved. He knew just what to do, and China marched forward to become a great country. Folks, that's not the way it happened, at least not at that time. Instead, Sun Yat-sen found that he had more problems than he could handle and was forced to give up his power to a general. Don't worry about the general's name, but he was forced to let a military dictatorship take over. And the dictatorship ran China, still calling itself a republic, but the dictatorship promised, once we get things squared away, I promise we'll give you people Western-style democracy, and you people deserve it, but we first have to solve our problems. And this is the excuse that many dictators in the 19th and 20th century would use when to justify their taking over. You'll have democracy, you'll have prosperity, once we get our problems solved. The year was 1911. Don't worry about the year so much. Oh yeah, The Last Emperor. The movie came out in 1987. There's a reference to it on page 647. And there they show a picture of the boy emperor with his mother behind him. Obviously, he was incapable of leading the Chinese nation. Sun Yat-sen took over in 1911. In 3 years, Europe itself was at war. All right, there's a lot more to tell, but I don't have time to tell it. When you come back on Tuesday, the first few minutes we'll talk about whatever I left off with on chapter 21. Now, there's a whole lot more to say in chapter 21 still, but in other words, you'll need to pick up what I don't say when I give the lecture for the next class on Monday. You'll need to pick it up on Monday. All right, is that clear to everybody?
Yep.
Yeah, we're going to do this way until we get caught up. I mean, yeah, I'm sounding like a dictator. Yeah, we're going to do it this way till we get all squared away. Then we're going to go back to the right way. Yeah, like an old-time dictator. All right.
Yeah.